In the summer of 1990, a family of 4 vanished without a trace while traveling along a desert highway in Arizona. For 14 years, there were no answers, only faded flyers, dead-end tips, and a silence that stretched across seasons, vast and unforgiving as the desert itself. The case file grew cold, then brittle, its pages yellowed with time and resignation. Then one spring morning, during a routine K-9 training near an old, forgotten gas station, something was found. A thread was pulled from the fabric of silence. And everything changed. Before we begin, if you're drawn to quiet stories like this, feel free to subscribe, turn on notifications, and share where you're listening from. We always wonder how far these stories travel, how many different skies they unfold beneath. Now, let's go back to Arizona, summer of 2004, and trace the first shadow. The wind along Highway 19 carried the dry scent of mesquite, rust, and forgotten things. Just outside Rust Creek, Arizona, a town that felt more like a punctuation mark at the end of a long, empty sentence, the old Coyote Flat gas station stood like a fossil. The roof sagged in the middle, a weary sigh held for decades. The windows were boarded, streaked with dust, and the ghosts of rainstorms past. The faded letters on the sign, once a cheerful red and white, had surrendered to the sun, becoming an illegible whisper that most locals didn't even glance at anymore. It was simply part of the landscape, as unremarkable as a cactus or a fence post. But this morning was different. The county had sent out a young officer named Jordan Reyes to run K-9 drills with Cooper, a retired search and rescue dog whose joints were stiff but whose nose was still as sharp as shattered glass. Tagging along, leaning against the warm metal of the patrol SUV, was Sheriff Glenn Mercer, now 2 years into a retirement that felt less like a reward and more like a long, quiet sentence. He wasn't on duty. He didn't have to be here. But he came because this patch of land, this specific stretch of forgotten highway, held a piece of him he'd never gotten back. The Whitaker case. The ghost that had haunted his entire career. He stood with arms crossed, the fabric of his plaid shirt soft and worn, watching the German Shepherd move with methodical grace through the brittle brush behind the station. Reyes, earnest and full of a procedural certainty Mercer remembered having himself once, called out simple commands. Find it, co-op seek. Cooper obeyed, nose to the ground, tail still and low, a sign of concentration, not excitement. He ignored the scent of rabbits and lizards, his world narrowed to a single, persistent question carried on the air. He's acting off, Reyes said, glancing back at the retired sheriff. His voice was young, cutting through the morning stillness. He's not tracking the training scent. He's onto something else. Mercer didn't answer right away. He just pushed himself off the SUV and walked closer, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. His eyes were locked on the spot where Cooper had stopped. It was right near the cracked rear wall of the station, where the cinder blocks had slumped in over time, forming a shallow depression in the earth. The ground there was different, darker. Cooper let out a single, low bark. It wasn't the frantic sound of a live find, nor the somber whine for human remains he'd been trained for. It was just focused, a statement of fact. Here, let him work, Mercer said, his voice a low rumble. He felt a familiar, unwelcome tightening in his chest. A cold knot of memory. Reyes crouched, offering quiet encouragement. Cooper sniffed intently at a patch of sunken concrete that looked like a poorly poured patch job from another lifetime. He started pawing, first gently, then with a growing urgency that sent up a thin cloud of pale dust. Mercer stepped forward, his shadow falling over the dog. That area was always weird, he murmured, more to himself than to Reyes. I remember walking back here years ago. Felt soft underfoot. Hollow. We figured it was just erosion. An old septic tank maybe. Never had cause to follow up. 100 small decisions, 1,000 overlooked details, all leading to 14 years of nothing. Reyes ran his gloved hand across the surface. The texture was different from the surrounding earth. Grittier. One of the cinder blocks set into the concrete patch was loose. He exchanged a look with Mercer. It wasn't a dramatic, movie moment glance. It was the slow, dawning understanding that passes between two lawmen when a quiet morning is about to end. Do we keep going? The unspoken answer was yes. Of course, yes. Reyes grabbed a crowbar from the SUV. With a groan of rusted metal and scraping cement, the block shifted. It came loose with a final, dusty sigh, revealing a darkness behind it. A narrow cavity, just wide enough for a person to crawl through. A puff of cool, still air spilled out, carrying a scent that wasn't of decay, but of confinement. The smell of a place where time had been trapped. Mercer exhaled, a breath he felt like he'd been holding since 1990. Get a flashlight. 10 minutes later, with backup on the way and the perimeter taped off in a stark yellow line against the muted desert tones, they eased down into the space. The drop was only about 4 feet. The air was still, not musty, just undisturbed. The kind of profound silence that feels earned over a long, long time. The beam from Reyes' heavy-duty flashlight cut a clean, white cone across the small room. Low ceiling. Cinder block walls, painted a pale, peeling blue. A bare bulb hung from a rusted wire, long dead. Dust floated in the beam like slow-motion snow. Then the light stopped. In the far corner, 4 sleeping bags were laid out side by side. Faded reds and blues, flattened by the weight of years. They were covered in the kind of fine, uniform dust that takes more than a decade to settle so completely. Beside them, a metal lunchbox, its lid propped slightly open. Inside, nestled like fragile artifacts, were a stack of Polaroid pictures. Reyes picked one up, his gloved fingers careful at the edges. These are old. The colors faded. Maybe late 80s or early 90s. Look. He passed it to Mercer. A teenage girl, blonde, with a look of fierce uncertainty in her eyes, sat cross-legged on the floor. Next to her, a boy no older than 10, his face partly obscured by a stuffed animal he clutched to his chest. In another photo, a man stood with one hand braced against the wall, the other on his wife's shoulder. They were looking toward the camera, not smiling, not posing, just existing, captured in a moment of weary endurance. Mercer's breath caught in his throat. He didn't need to see the faded flyers in the cold case file. He knew those faces as well as he knew his own. The Whitaker family. Daniel, Marianne, Rachel, Joey. A family of 4 who'd vanished on a road trip heading east. Last seen refueling at this very station. The case that had defined his early years on the force, and the one that had become his greatest failure. He stepped deeper into the room, his movement slow, careful not to disturb the sacred dust. On a makeshift shelf above the sleeping bags sat a cassette player. The plastic was cracked and brittle, covered in grit. A label on the tape inside had been written in careful, looping handwriting, now faded to a ghostly blue, July 15th. Reyes turned his flashlight beam slowly toward the far wall, panning across the empty space. Sir, there's a notebook. It had been tucked behind a broken milk crate, almost hidden. A standard spiral-bound notebook. The front cover was torn. Mercer took it in his gloved hands, feeling its impossible weight. He opened it. The handwriting was delicate, slanted. Marianne's. It began with the mundane, hopeful notes of a mother on a family trip. June 9th. Rachel saw a jackrabbit today and actually put her book down. Joey keeps asking if every snake we see is a rattlesnake. Daniel says the car is running well. So far, so good. Then, a few pages later, the tone shifted. The ink seemed darker, the pressure of the pen harder. June 14th. Something isn't right. We hear noises upstairs at night. Someone's walking. Daniel says it's just the building settling, but this feels different. It's a heavy sound, deliberate. And then, the last entry he read in that moment. June 18th. I don't know how long we've been here. The days blur. The bulb went out. The kids sleep beside me. Their breathing is the only clock I have. Daniel is trying to stay calm for them, but I see it in his eyes when he thinks no one is looking. Reyes looked at Mercer, his face pale in the reflected glow of the flashlight. His voice was a near whisper. How could this be here all this time? Mercer didn't answer. He was lost in the chasm of 14 years. They had searched hundreds of square miles of open desert, followed leads to 3 different states, interviewed every drifter and trucker who'd been through the area. And all this time. He walked to the edge of the sleeping bags. There, peeking out from beneath a layer of settled silt, was a child's drawing. Crayon on folded paper. A bright yellow sun. A small blue car. 4 stick figures holding hands. And a square building with a crooked roof. He reached down and, with infinite care, turned the page over. On the back, scrawled in a child's desperate, unsteady hand, was one word. Help. The silence settled again, heavier this time, filled with the ghost of unheard pleas. Above them, the world moved on. Trucks hummed past on the highway. Birds chirped in the scrub. But down here, in this small, forgotten tomb, time had stopped. Or maybe it had just waited. Cooper whined softly at the entrance above, a mournful sound that echoed in the confined space. Mercer stood still for a long time, the notebook feeling heavier than stone in his hands. They were here, he said finally, the words tasting like rust and regret. All these years, they were right here. And now, the story was no longer just a mystery. It had a voice, a place, a room beneath the ground, waiting, finally, to be heard. The camera clicked, a satisfying mechanical sound in the bright, thin air of a Mesa morning. Then it clicked again. Rachel Whitaker squinted into the viewfinder of her Polaroid, adjusting the little focus wheel with a practiced thumb, then snapped one more shot. The desert light was already breathing heat, even though it was just past 8. It bleached the colors out of everything, making the world look overexposed. Her dad, Daniel, leaned against the hood of the old blue station wagon, a Ford Country Squire with fake wood paneling that was starting to peel at the edges. He folded his arms, smiling in that tired, gentle way he always did before a long drive. "You out of film yet, Wretch? We've got 1,000 miles of road to see." "Almost," Rachel said, lowering the camera. She flapped the developing photo in the air. "You blinked again. That's 3 in a row." Daniel Whitaker laughed, a soft, warm sound that got lost in the vastness of the suburban morning. "That is the only face I've got, sweetheart. Blink and all." He was a man who looked perpetually thoughtful, an accountant who dreamed of being a cartographer, his pockets always full of maps and folded receipts. Inside the house, Mary Ann packed the last of the sandwiches into the cooler. She moved with a quiet, focused rhythm, the same steady grace she used in the 4th grade classroom she left behind a year ago to focus on the kids. Her elegant handwriting was on every little Ziploc bag: turkey, no mayo, Joey, PB&J, Rachel. Napkins tucked between them. 2 apples for juice boxes, a bag of pretzels. A universe of maternal care packed into a red and white cooler. Out in the yard, her son, Joey, was spinning in slow circles, arms outstretched like airplane wings, making soft engine noises with his mouth. He wore the same pair of sneakers from the previous year, now a little too tight at the toes. He had insisted on bringing along his stuffed raccoon, a threadbare creature with one button eye, named Dennis. Dennis rode everywhere these days, his silent presence a comfort. Passenger seat, motel pillows, picnic benches. Mary Ann stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her jeans. "You got sunscreen on, buddy?" Joey dropped his arms with a dramatic groan. "Mom, I'm not a baby." "You're 9, Rachel called from the driveway, her voice carrying a teasing older sister authority. "That's like 1 year past baby." "1." Joey stuck out his tongue, a gesture of defiance that made Daniel smile. He opened the car door, the hinges squeaking a protest. All right, that's enough," he said. "Buckle up, everybody. Operation Desert Escape is officially behind schedule." They were heading west first, a winding tour through the state before cutting up through the mountains, then circling back toward the painted desert. Daniel had mapped it all out in his notebook, a spiral-bound thing filled with neat mileage calculations, potential gas stations, and at least 3 roadside attractions that promised the world's largest something or other. He had even scheduled a night of camping in a remote spot near the Nevada border. No lights, no people. He'd promised the family a week earlier over dinner. Just us, the stars, and the coyotes. Mary Ann had smiled at that. "Coyotes are people too, Dan." The station wagon, loaded with suitcases, a cooler, and teenage angst, pulled out of their small driveway in Mesa and turned onto the open road. Rachel snapped another photo through the rear window, capturing the image of their house growing smaller, her mom's lush hanging plants blurring into a soft green smudge. It was a perfect, ordinary moment. This wasn't a trip to anywhere in particular. It was a pause, a deep breath before the winds of change scattered them. A little time before Rachel started her first year at the University of Arizona, a world away in Tucson, and before Joey got too big to believe in the silent wisdom of Dennis the raccoon anymore. It was a trip about being a wee before they became separate eyes. They drove through shimmering heat waves and dry wind, the radio playing a mix of Tom Petty and the Bangles. They passed gas stations with cracked signs and diners with hand-painted menus offering chicken fried steak and dusty slices of pie. At one point, Daniel pulled over near a line of old, sun-bleached mailboxes so Joey could stretch his legs. The boy ran in delighted circles, chasing his own shadow. Rachel took a photo of it. Mary Ann leaned her head on Daniel's shoulder, a silent gesture of contentment. At dusk, they stopped at a motel with a buzzing neon sign that read El Canto Inn, and a pool that shimmered like a turquoise mirage. Joey swam until his fingers were wrinkled and he was too tired to complain about bedtime. Rachel sat outside on a white plastic lawn chair, the kind that always felt a little sticky, writing in her notebook. She always carried it, its pages filled with observations, doodles, and quotes she half remembered from books. Daniel sat beside her, sipping weak, lukewarm coffee from a paper cup. Excited? He asked, his voice quiet in the evening air, which was now filled with the sound of crickets. About school, she asked, not looking up from her page. About everything, he replied. The future. All of it. Rachel shrugged, the slight, non-committal gesture of a teenager poised on the brink of a new life. Sort of. I guess I'm scared I'll change too much. That I won't be me. Daniel looked at her for a long second, his gaze soft. Some things change, Ratch. They're supposed to. But the important things, the real things, they just grow deeper. The next morning, they loaded up the car again, the cooler a little lighter, the kids a little grumpier. They passed the sign for Rust Creek just after 10:30. The gas needle on the station wagon was flirting with empty. The orange light had been on for the last 10 miles. Coyote Flat was the only station for miles, a lonely outpost on the edge of nothing. It sat just off the shoulder of Highway 19, looking tired even then. Peeling paint. A single, ancient pump. A small main building with one window shuttered closed, as if it were sleeping. Daniel pulled in slowly, the tires crunching on the loose gravel. Looks like it's still working, he said, a note of relief in his voice. Inside, the air smelled of oil, old wood, and something faintly sweet, like stale soda. Joey, his energy renewed, begged for a Coke from the humming glass-fronted cooler. Marian picked out a small bottle of aspirin for a headache that was just beginning to bloom behind her eyes. Rachel, ever the observer, found a dusty rack of Polaroid film and raised her eyebrows. Vintage, she muttered to herself. The man behind the counter was older, maybe in his 60s. Thin and weathered, with a face like a dried riverbed. His name tag, pinned crookedly to his shirt, read, Harold. He rang them up with a quiet economy of movement, his eyes avoiding theirs. He didn't offer a greeting or a goodbye. Rachel asked if she could take a photo out front. Go ahead, Harold said, his voice raspy, barely a whisper. Just not of me. She stepped back outside into the blinding sun, lifted her camera, and framed the shot. The pump, the old sign, the sun sitting like a hot coin above the metal roof. It was a perfect, lonely image. Joey ran to her side, pointing toward the thick brush beyond the gravel lot. You think they got snakes out here? He asked, his voice a mix of fear and excitement. Probably, she said, not looking at him. Big ones. He glanced at the brush. Cool. Daniel finished pumping the gas, the smell sharp and chemical in the hot air. Marianne leaned against the car door, fanning herself with the station's receipt. Back in, Daniel asked, wiping his hands on a rag. Let's do it, Marianne said, her smile a little strained from the heat. Rachel snapped one last photo as they pulled away, catching Joey's face pressed to the back window. Dennis the raccoon clutched tightly in his hands, his button eye staring out at the receding gas station. Then the car rolled forward, turned east, and merged back onto the empty highway. And that was the last time anyone saw the Whitaker family. The road ahead of them stretched clean and bright. The desert shimmered with heat and unspoken promises. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the silence was waiting. It began to fall, softly at first, then all at once, covering their tracks completely. In Rust Creek, people still talk about that summer, but not in the way you might think. Not in the bustling coffee shop on Main Street. Not loudly over beers at the town's only bar. It's quieter than that. It's a story passed around in glances across a grocery store aisle, in a sudden hush when a blue station wagon drives by. It's something held in the chest, not on the tongue. A civic ghost story everyone knows, but no one tells. The Whitaker family had only passed through. 1 tank of gas, 1 bag of ice, 2 sodas, and a bottle of aspirin. But the silence they left behind settled over the town like a fine layer of dust that no wind could ever blow away. Sheriff Glenn Mercer had been 31 back then. Still green, still full of the kind of sharp-edged certainty that wears thin after enough years and enough unanswered questions. He remembered the call clearly, the voice of Marianne's sister from Nevada, tight with a panic that was just starting to curdle into dread. The family had never arrived for their planned visit. No calls, no messages, no accidents had been logged on the state system. No hospital check-ins, just nothing. He had driven out to the old Coyote Flat station the next morning. He stood there for the better part of an hour, the pump still faintly stained with a spot of fresh gas, the gravel undisturbed save for the tire tracks of 100 other passing cars. He interviewed Harold Boone, the clerk. Boone had been vague, unhelpful. Said the family seemed fine. A normal family. The girl smiled. The boy asked about rattlesnakes. And then they drove away, east. Mercer had looked down that long, straight road, the asphalt shimmering in the heat, waiting for something to shift, for some answer to appear on the horizon. It never did. Over the next week, a search was mounted. It began with hope. Volunteers came in from nearby towns. Church groups organized and passed out flyers with the smiling, hopeful faces of the Whitakers. Helicopters from the state police crisscrossed the vast, empty expanse of the desert, their rotors beating a desperate rhythm against the silence. Bloodhounds ran the brush until their paws were raw and their noses were full of nothing but dust and disappointment. The air grew hotter. The hope grew quieter. I kept thinking we'd find something. A tire track leading off-road. A dropped camera. A piece of clothing caught on a cactus. Mercer would say years later to a rookie deputy, his voice heavy with the memory. But it was like the desert just swallowed them whole. Like they drove straight off the edge of the world. In town, the disappearance had a chilling effect. People started locking their doors earlier. Parents held their children's hands a little tighter. Tourists, who once saw the desert as a place of rugged beauty, now seemed to see it as a place of hidden threats. They passed through with shorter stops and nervous glances. And the Coyote Flat station, once a reliable, if run-down, fill-up on the way to Lake Havasu, began to lose business. People just didn't want to stop there anymore. It felt tainted. The man who ran it, Harold Boone, shut it down for good a year later. He told the local paper it was because of the new interstate bypass, but everyone knew the real reason. He said the place gave him headaches, that the silence out there was too loud. No one bought the property. No one bothered to clean the windows or pull the weeds. And slowly, Coyote Flat became a landmark for something unspoken, a monument to a question mark. Every now and then, a reporter would come sniffing around. A fresh face from Tucson, a cynical veteran from Phoenix, even a writer from a national magazine once. They always left with the same thing: empty notepads and a sense of profound futility. The story was too thin. No violence, no ransom, no note, no trace, no hook. Just one quiet, inexplicable disappearance. But for Tom Whitaker, it was never quiet. The silence was a roar in his ears. He had been 27 when his older brother Daniel and his family vanished. He lived in Flagstaff, working night shifts at a hardware store, saving up for his own place, living a life of simple, forward momentum. He still remembered the phone ringing in his small apartment, the confused sound of his aunt's voice on the line. Still remembered the way his legs had given out from under him before he'd even finished dialing the sheriff's office in Rust Creek. Tom came down himself. He stood in that same gravel lot, staring into the oppressive sun just like Mercer had. But where Mercer saw a crime scene, Tom saw the last place on earth his family had been. He walked the highway for miles in both directions, his eyes scanning the ditches, the brush, the endless horizon. He slept in his car. He taped up his own homemade flyers, the ink bleeding slightly in the heat. He called Rachel's friends from high school, Marianne's former colleagues, dozens of gas stations and motels up and down the route. The trail was cold. It had never been warm. Sheriff Mercer did what he could. He admired the younger brother's tenacity. But the file got thinner with each passing month, while the look in Tom's eyes grew heavier, more haunted. Over time, the town went back to its regular rhythms. Kids grew up. Stores changed hands. The high school repainted its gym. But that station just sat there, year after year, slowly decaying under the Arizona sun. The sign faded from a whisper to nothing. The paint peeled away in long strips. The roof dipped in the middle like a sigh too tired to finish. People stopped asking. They stopped looking. But Tom never did. He came back every summer, on the anniversary. He'd park his truck in the same spot where the blue station wagon had been. He'd leave a small bouquet of wildflowers or a laminated photo, sometimes just a note folded inside a plastic sandwich bag, weighted down with a smooth, gray rock. He never made a speech. He never knocked on doors to ask the same old questions. He just stood there for a few hours, a silent vigil against the encroaching silence, then drove away. Some of the locals thought it was sad. Others called it a strange kind of devotion. But everyone in Rust Creek knew who he was. The man who still looked. Mercer, now gray-haired and nearing retirement, kept the Whitaker file in a separate drawer in his desk. Not because there was new information. There never was. But because closing it, officially stamping it unsolved, inactive, felt like a betrayal, he would take it out sometimes. Late at night, when the office was quiet and the only sound was the hum of the vending machine in the hall, he'd flip through the photos. The grainy one of the family at a rest stop, all of them squinting into the sun. The receipt from the gas station, its ink almost completely faded. The timeline he had drawn in pencil, smudged at the corners from years of being touched. There were no updates, but he still checked, as if the paper itself might absorb the years of silence and finally confess what it knew. "This was my first real case as sheriff," he once told a young deputy who'd asked about the old file. "I thought I would solve it in a week. I thought I had all the time in the world." The deputy had said nothing. There was nothing to say. By the early 2000s, the station had become more myth than memory. Teenagers dared each other to sneak inside and peek through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. They claimed they heard whispers behind the rotting doors, the sound of a woman humming a lullaby. The building sagged but stood, as if it were waiting for something or someone to come back. And then one spring morning, a retired dog with a sharp nose and a quiet focus sniffed the ground behind it. And after 14 years of roaring silence, something answered. The air in the underground room was cooler than the desert morning, but it was a dead cold, a stagnant cold. It was the temperature of a place that had been sealed off from the living world for a very long time. Tom Whitaker stepped carefully down the makeshift ladder the deputies had set up, his hands steady on the rungs, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. He ducked as his feet touched the concrete floor, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom, which was now cut by the harsh, sterile beams of forensic lights. The light passed over chipped paint, the damp-stained walls, and a silence that felt heavier than sound. Sheriff Glenn Mercer followed behind him, moving slower, his knees complaining with every step. The years had taken their toll, but he wouldn't have stayed away. He couldn't. This was the period at the end of the sentence that had defined his life. The county forensics team was already at work, a small group of people moving with a hushed, reverent efficiency. They spoke in murmurs, their words absorbed by the thick, waiting air. Gloves, swabs, evidence bags, the soft click of a camera shutter. Tom's gaze went immediately to the far wall. The 4 sleeping bags were still laid out side by side, a ghostly tableau. They were flattened, discolored by time and moisture. One, a small red one that must have been Joey's, had a child's sock, once white, now gray, tucked underneath its edge. Another, a blue one, had a faded, frayed ribbon tied to the zipper pull, something Rachel would have done. Beside them sat the battered red lunchbox, its metal scratched and dented along the lid. The Polaroids were inside, now carefully laid out on an evidence cloth by the techs. Rachel, Joey, their faces, captured in the dim, claustrophobic light of this room, were unmistakable. With gloved fingers, Tom picked one up. Rachel looked straight at the camera, her chin tilted in a familiar, defiant way, but her eyes were wide and uncertain. Joey sat next to her, cradling that old raccoon toy, Dennis. His name had been Dennis. Tom's throat tightened as the small, forgotten detail surfaced in his memory. There was no posing in the photo, no smiles. It was a picture of survival, not of life. A document of endurance. He took a slow, ragged breath and turned toward the broken milk crate in the corner. One of the technicians had found the cassette player wedged inside, and next to it, the tape with the faded label, July 15th. Someone had written it in neat, looping letters. Almost certainly Marianne. She was the family's archivist, the one who labeled everything. Tom stood frozen as one of the technicians, a young woman with kind eyes, looked at Mercer, then at him, seeking permission. Mercer gave a slight nod. She pressed the play button on a portable unit they'd brought down. The hiss came first. The sound of empty tape, of time passing. Then a pause. Then a voice, soft and steady, filled the small, cold room. It was Rachel's. And the bear said, "I am not afraid of the dark, because I have you." And the little fox said, "Even if all the lights go out, I know you are there, and that is my own special kind of light." Her voice trembled, just a little, on the last few words. She was holding it together, but the strain was there, a fine crack in the porcelain of her calm. Tom could hear Joey breathing softly in the background, a tiny, rhythmic sound. Joey is still listening. He's holding Dennis tight. It's almost bedtime, or what we call bedtime. Mom says we have to keep our hope. Maybe tomorrow, someone will come. The tape clicked. Then, only static. The sound of nothing. One of the techs reached to stop it, but Mercer held up a hand, his face a grim mask. Let it play out. More hiss. More empty silence. It was as if the tape itself had run out of hope. Rachel's voice had always been light, but thoughtful, like her mother's. Tom felt a burning sensation behind his eyes. He had to look away, toward the damp cinder block wall, pretending to study the peeling paint. No one in the room said a word. "Sir." "Found something else," one of the deputies called from the rear wall. He was shining his light on the spiral notebook. The forensics chief had already dusted it for prints, finding only smudges, and handed it to Mercer, who in turn passed it to Tom. The pages were stiff, but the ink was still legible. Marianne's early entries were calm, almost clinical, as she tried to impose order on chaos. She wrote about rationing the food Daniel had bought at the gas station, about Daniel trying to keep their spirits up with bad jokes, about singing old folk songs to pass the endless hours. But as the pages turned, the tone shifted, became more desperate. June 20th. "We are rationing the food now. Daniel thinks we have enough for 5 more days if we are careful. The water is what worries me. There is a pipe that drips in the corner. Daniel says it's not safe to drink." June 24th. "I hear someone walking upstairs at night. Heavy boots. Deliberate steps. Sometimes they stop right above us. We all hold our breath. Just stop and stand there, listening." June 26th. Rachel swears she heard someone whisper her name through the vent near the ceiling. I did not hear it, but I believe her. The look on her face. I will never forget it. June 29th. We are trying to stay quiet. The lights from the hallway above flicker sometimes under the door we cannot open. We do not know if it is day or night anymore. Time is a soup. Mercer stood beside Tom, reading over his shoulder, his presence a silent, heavy comfort. "They held on," he said, his voice thick with a mixture of awe and sorrow. "They held on longer than anyone could have imagined." Tom turned the page. The next entry was in a different hand. Rachel's. July 1st. "Joey draws pictures now. It calms him down. It calms me down too. Today he drew the gas station. He made the sun red." Paperclipped to that page was a folded drawing, done with the few crayons they must have had. Tom opened it slowly. It was a child's crude sketch of the station. The square building, the bent sign, the single pump. For stick figures stood beside a blue rectangle, the car. And above it all, a large, angry red sun with jagged, uneven rays. In the corner, a smiling animal with a striped tail. A raccoon. Dennis. Tom stared at it, his vision blurring. He didn't say anything for a long, long time. Mercer placed a hand on his shoulder, a rare gesture of physical comfort from the stoic man. "Sometimes, that's all a child has," he said softly. "To draw the thing they are trying not to feel." Tom nodded, unable to speak. His voice, when it finally came, was low and raw. "They were right here. This whole time. Less than 6 miles from the main road. We all drove past. I drove past. Year after year after year." Mercer said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. One of the techs stepped over, holding up a small evidence bag. Inside was a small metal button. It was wedged between the floorboards near the entrance, he said. "Looks like it came off a jacket." Tom took the bag gently. The button was scratched, nearly smooth from wear, but under the harsh light, a faint, stylized letter was still visible. A W. He swallowed hard. Rachel's. Her windbreaker. A blue one with white trim. She loved that jacket. She wore it on the trip. They bagged the drawing, the button, the notebook. The team continued to comb the small room, finding food wrappers with expiration dates from 1989, faint shoe prints, a cracked plastic comb with a few strands of blonde hair still tangled in its teeth. But it wasn't the objects themselves that were so haunting. It was how they sat there, undisturbed, as if time had pulled its hands back and let this single, terrible moment freeze, perfectly preserved in dust and darkness. Later that night, long after the forensics team had packed up and left, sealing the room behind them, Tom sat in his truck parked in the gravel lot outside the station. The desert wind moved through the brush, a slow, even whisper. He played the cassette again on his truck's old player. Rachel's voice, clear and heartbreakingly young, filled the cab. "We are okay. We are all together. If someone finds this, tell my Uncle Tom I still want to visit Flagstaff and see the snow. Tell him not to worry." Tom closed his eyes, leaning his head against the cool glass of the window. She remembered him. Even in the dark, she remembered. And that was more than enough to keep him searching, not for them anymore, but for the truth of what happened in this terrible, quiet place. The sun over Rust Creek had begun its slow, deliberate drop behind the distant, dusty hills by the time Sheriff Mercer's knuckles rapped against the thin aluminum door of the trailer. The screen clattered shut behind him, a loose, lonely sound. The air here, at the forgotten edge of town, smelled of dry sage, rusted metal, and the quiet desperation of a life lived at the margins. Harold Boone lived alone now, and had for a long time. His trailer sat on a packed dirt lot, tucked between skeletal scrub trees and a collapsed barbed wire fence. The grass, if there ever was any, had long since surrendered to the heat and neglect. A single, stained plastic chair sat on the porch, angled toward nothing in particular, as if its owner had given up on finding a view worth watching. Mercer adjusted his hat and waited. He was a patient man. The desert had taught him that. He didn't knock again. After a long moment, the door opened a crack. A sliver of a face peeked out. Harold Boone's eyes, yellowed and sunk deep into his skull, blinked against the fading light. A week's growth of white stubble covered a jaw that seemed too fragile to support the weight of his regrets. When he saw who was standing there, he didn't speak. His face, already a roadmap of hardship, seemed to fold in on itself. "Harold," Mercer said, his voice calm and even, carrying no accusation. "You know why I'm here." Boone looked past him for a moment, down the dirt track, as if hoping someone else might be standing there, a buffer between him and this inevitable conversation. No one was. "I ain't got anything for you, Glenn," he said, his voice as brittle as a dead leaf. "I think you might," Mercer replied, his gaze unwavering. "It's about the Whitaker family." The name hung in the air between them. Boone's thin fingers tightened on the doorframe, his knuckles white. "They were found, Harold, this morning, down below, under your old station." A long, heavy pause settled. The wind rustled the dry leaves of a nearby cottonwood. Finally, Boone let go of the door, and it swung open the rest of the way with a weary groan. He stepped back into the shadows of his home. "You want coffee?" he asked, the offer a strange, jarring note of civility. "It's old." Mercer followed him inside. The trailer smelled of dust, stale cigarette smoke, and canned beans. It was cluttered but not dirty, the sad, organized chaos of a man living alone for too long. Boone shuffled to the small stove and poured a dark, oily liquid into two mismatched mugs. "I didn't know," he said, his back still to Mercer. "Not for sure. Not at first." Mercer sat at the small formica table, which wobbled slightly. "You owned the station until 91. They went missing in July of 90. You were there for months after." Boone lowered himself into the opposite chair with a soft grunt, his joints protesting. "I know when they went missing," he said, staring at the black liquid in his cup, but not drinking. "I count the days same as you, maybe." He rubbed at the side of his nose, a nervous, repetitive gesture. "I never opened that hatch in the back room. Never. That whole part of the building, it always gave me a bad feeling. It was cold in the summer. You could feel it through the soles of your shoes. Never made sense. But you knew it was there," Mercer pressed gently. "I knew something was there. An old cellar, a storm shelter, I figured. The fella I bought the place from said to just leave it be." Mercer waited, letting the silence do the work. Boone's gaze drifted to the single, grimy window. "One night, maybe a couple months after they disappeared, I was closing up. It was late, real quiet. I heard something, a sound, coming up from the floor in the back. It was like humming, not music, just a low, steady voice. A woman's voice. I couldn't make out words." Mercer didn't blink. "I told myself I was tired, that the wind was playing tricks on me. But the next morning, the door to that back storage room was ajar. Not wide, just a crack. I always kept it locked." "You never checked?" "I started to," Boone confessed, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I pushed the door open, stepped inside. The floor had that feel again. Soft, spongy, like it wasn't supposed to hold a man's weight. And the cold, it was worse. I got scared, Glenn. I turned around, walked out, and locked the main station doors. I drove home and never went back in that part of the building again." He finally took a sip of the coffee and winced. "That's the God's honest truth. I told myself it wasn't my business. I needed that job. The station was all I had left. It was the simple, pathetic cowardice of a man afraid of losing the little he had." Mercer understood it, even if he couldn't forgive it. "Did you ever see anyone else near the station? Anyone who didn't belong?" Boone nodded slowly, his eyes distant with memory. "There was a guy, showed up a few times that summer. Maybe late 30s, early 40s. Always wore a dirty ball cap pulled down low, and a dark jacket, even in the heat. Used to hang around the dumpster sometimes, or just sit in his old pickup truck across the highway. Didn't talk, just watched the place. Did he ever go inside? Not that I saw. But after all this, I wouldn't bet on anything now. Mercer stood up and left his business card on the table. If you remember anything else, Harold, a license plate number, the make of the truck, anything at all, you call me, no matter the hour. Boone nodded but didn't look up from his mug. He just sat there, a ghost in his own life, haunted by a sound he'd tried for 14 years to forget. 2 days later, following the thinnest of leads from Boone's vague description, Mercer and Tom drove north, toward a desolate stretch of desert near the county line. A deputy, now retired himself, had remembered a name from that era. Travis Denton. A drifter, a transient who sometimes worked odd jobs for ranchers, and sometimes just disappeared for months at a time. He was known for being harmless, and for seeing things others missed. They found him living behind a sprawling junkyard, in an old, dilapidated camper that looked like it might collapse in a stiff wind. He came out barefoot, chewing on sunflower seeds, his hair a tangled mess, his shirt half-buttoned. He squinted at Mercer's badge, then at Tom's grim face. "I didn't do nothing," he said, his voice wary. "No one said you did," Mercer replied calmly. "We just want to ask you a few questions." Tom stepped forward, his patience worn thin. "You used to hang around the Coyote Flat station, back in the summer of 1990. Travis looked at him sideways, his chewing slowing. "I might have. Slept in the brush out back a few nights. Quieter than the truck stops. We heard you might have seen something," Tom said, his voice tight. "Or someone." Travis spat a shell onto the dirt. "Might have heard something. Might have seen a woman and 2 kids once, real late at night, peeking out from a crack in the back wall. Thought maybe I was seeing things. Heat does that to you." Mercer stayed quiet, letting Tom lead. Travis looked at Tom again, a flicker of something like pity in his eyes. The girl had long blonde hair. The little boy, he never let go of some stuffed animal he was holding. Tom's stomach turned over. "Dennis the raccoon. They didn't come out," Travis continued, his voice lower now. "But sometimes, late at night, if you were real quiet, you could hear them. Through that back wall. Little sounds. Like they were moving real careful, trying not to make noise." Did you talk to them?" Tom asked, his voice cracking slightly. "Once," Travis said, looking down at his bare feet. "Couldn't get close. But I left some bread I had, and a plastic bottle of water. Just sat it by the side wall, right where I'd heard the sound. Figured if someone was in there, they'd find it." "Did they take it?" "Next morning, it was gone. That was enough for me. Knew I wasn't crazy. Why didn't you say anything?" Tom demanded, his fists clenched in his jacket pockets. "Why didn't you call the police?" Travis laughed once, a dry, humorless bark. "You think anyone listens to a guy like me? A guy sleeping behind gas stations? I tried to tell one of your deputies once, down at the diner. He told me to sleep it off and stay away from Boone Station." Tom's hands were shaking now, with a fury that had no target. "There's something else," Travis said, his voice dropping even lower, as if sharing a sacred secret. "One night, I was sleeping not too far from the station, real quiet, and I heard singing. Not a song I knew, just a woman's voice. Real soft and sad, like she was trying not to cry while she was singing a lullaby." Tom looked at Mercer, a sickening wave of recognition washing over him. The cassette tape, Rachel's voice, Mary Ann's journal. Travis glanced toward the distant hills. "I ain't been back to that place since. Don't ever want to. It ain't right, what happened in that place. It's a bad patch of ground." Mercer wrote down what he could, but Tom just stood there, silent, the desert wind feeling colder than it had any right to be. As they drove back toward Rust Creek, the dust swirling across the road like lost souls, Tom knew they were closer to the truth. But it wasn't a comfort. It was just heavier, and the silence it left behind was more profound than ever. The air inside the evidence locker at the county sheriff's department was always dry and cold, smelling faintly of paper and plastic. But today it felt worse than usual, like a tomb for forgotten tragedies. Tom Whitaker sat at a stark metal table under a flickering fluorescent light, his gloved hands resting on the plastic sleeve that held Mary Ann's journal. He had read it twice already, back to front, but something kept pulling him back, a desperate need to find a clue, a name, anything he might have missed in the delicate, slanted script. He took a slow, deep breath and opened it to the final entries. It was Rachel's handwriting that appeared first. The ink was thinner, paler. Her letters, once full of the confident curves of a teenager, had become straight, cramped strokes, as if she were conserving every last ounce of strength, every drop of ink. July 5th. Mom says the air is different today. Thicker. Joey has not spoken since the night of the noises. He just draws. We don't talk much now. Only when we have to. I miss the sky. I try to remember what blue looks like, but it's starting to fade. Tom let his fingers hover over the page, an inch of air separating him from her last recorded thoughts. July 6th. I saw something in the vent. A shadow. Not light. Something else. I heard a sound like someone breathing on the other side. Slow and deep. Then it stopped. I didn't tell Mom. There was a dark smudge across the next line, blurring the words. Maybe from a dirty finger. Maybe from a tear. There was no way to tell. He flipped the page. Marianne's handwriting took over again. It was stronger than Rachel's, but laced with a frantic urgency that broke through her usually calm demeanor. July 7th. Rachel has a fever. It's high. We gave her the last of the aspirin from the car. Joey clings to her even in her sleep, like he's trying to guard her. I keep dreaming that we are home, that I can smell rain on the asphalt, and then I wake up to the sound of metal shifting somewhere above us. Tom paused again. On the next page, scribbled violently in what looked like the side margin, were 3 sharp lines, the pen having dug deep into the paper. Help us. He comes at night. June 26th. The date. The date Rachel heard someone whisper her name. The day everything must have truly changed. The day hope began to die. Mercer stood quietly near the door, his arms crossed. He hadn't interrupted. He just waited, a silent sentinel. There's more, Tom said, his voice husky. He turned to the inside of the back cover of the journal. Folded into a small, tight square and tucked between the cardboard and the final page was a scrap of flannel. Red and blue plaid. Torn from something. Rachel's shirt. Tom whispered, recognizing the pattern instantly. She wore it the day they left. I remember because she spilled orange juice on it at breakfast. Mercer stepped forward, his face grim. We found something else. Near the vent in the ceiling of that room. He led Tom to a large evidence table where a metal tray was laid out. Inside lay the rusted, square vent cover, bent at one corner as if it had been pried open. And there, snagged on a jagged nail dark with corrosion, was a single, long strand of light brown hair. DNA came back this morning, Mercer said quietly. It was Rachel's. Tom nodded slowly. He didn't need to speak. The story was telling itself now, in these silent, heartbreaking artifacts. There were photographs of footprints, too. Several sets belonging to the family, and one other. A single, large boot print in the dust near the vent. The tread pattern was deep, distinctive. It belonged to no one in the Whitaker family. We think someone opened the vent from above, Mercer explained, pointing to the photo. Maybe to listen. Maybe to drop something in. Tom stared at the bent metal of the real vent cover on the tray. Or maybe, he said, the words cold and hard in his mouth, to make sure they were still down there. To watch them. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The low hum of the building's ventilation system seemed to roar in the silence. The weight of what had happened, the calculated cruelty of it, settled in the room, making it hard to breathe. Tom returned to the journal, his hands shaking almost imperceptibly. The very last entry. Marianne's hand. July 8th. I am writing in the dark now. The flashlight is dead. Rachel is sleeping. Her breathing is shallow. Joey still won't talk. I think he is trying to protect her with his silence. I told them a story about a family of stars who got lost, but found their way home by following the sound of their father's laughter. I don't know if they heard me. Tom closed the journal gently. It felt like closing a casket. Outside the evidence room, the hallway buzzed with the mundane, fluorescent light of a normal workday. But inside, time had stopped in the summer of 1990. Nothing had changed for the Whitakers after June 26th. Only the light had dimmed. Only the pages had thinned. And somewhere, just a few feet above their heads, someone had been watching. Someone had been listening. Tom had never been a superstitious man, but there was something about the back of the Coyote Flat gas station that made the hair on his arms stand up, even now. The old gravel lot behind the building had been mostly reclaimed by weeds and littered with rusted soda cans. But one thing always stood out, a small beacon of defiance against the decay. A cluster of fresh white daisies, tied with simple twine, left gently against the frame of the boarded-up back door. Not the front door, where tourists might see. Always the back. Mercer had mentioned them to him years ago. Said that every spring, around the anniversary of the disappearance, like clockwork, someone left a small bunch of flowers. He'd never seen who it was. They were just there in the morning, a quiet, anonymous tribute. This time, Tom decided to find out who. It wasn't hard. In a town as small as Rust Creek, a mystery like that had soft edges. A few quiet questions at the local diner led him to a name. Evelyn Maddox. She used to be a nurse at the county clinic before it closed down. Retired now, she lived on the edge of town near the old train yard, in a small house with a yard full of wind chimes and lavender bushes. When Tom knocked on her door, she opened it without hesitation, as if she'd been expecting him for 14 years. She was an older woman with kind, clear eyes and hair the color of snow. "You have your brother's eyes," she said, her voice soft but steady. Tom was taken aback. "You knew Daniel?" "I knew the family," she corrected gently. "Not well. Just once. Please, come in, if you'd like." The house smelled of lemon polish and cedar. It was a place of peace and order. A tabby cat watched them from the arm of a comfortable-looking couch, but didn't stir. Evelyn moved slowly but with a sense of purpose, leading him to a small, sunlit sitting room. Family photos lined the mantelpiece. It was June. Evelyn began, easing into her favorite armchair. The middle of June, 1990. Maybe a week or so before they went missing. A woman came into the clinic with a teenage girl. The woman said her name was Harper, but I knew it wasn't her real name the second she said it. Tom leaned forward slightly, his heart starting to beat a little faster. Why? Her hands were shaking, and she kept looking at the door. But mostly, it was the girl. She had a high fever, shivering in the middle of a 100-degree day, her lips pale. The woman kept saying it was just sunstroke, that they'd been hiking. But it wasn't sunstroke. Her pupils were dilated. She was lethargic. It was something else. An infection, maybe. "Can you remember what the woman looked like?" Tom asked. Evelyn nodded, her eyes looking into the past. Shoulder-length brown hair. Kind eyes, but they looked like she hadn't slept in a week. She was polite, careful with her words, fiercely protective of the girl. She said they were just passing through, on their way to California. The girl called her mom, but only once, and it was so soft, almost like she wasn't supposed to. Tom's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Rachel and Marianne." "I believe so," Evelyn said. "I gave the girl some fluids and an anti-inflammatory. I told the mother she needed to take her to a real hospital in Flagstaff, that this could be serious." She nodded, thanked me profusely, paid in cash, and they left. I never saw them again. I've thought about it every year since. Evelyn got up slowly, walked to an old wooden secretary desk in the corner, and pulled out a small, worn photo album. She flipped through a few pages and pulled out a slightly faded photograph. This was taken that same week. A little birthday party for one of the other nurses. That woman, Marianne, she's in the background, near the door, waiting. It's the only picture I ever had of her. Tom took the photo. The face was slightly out of focus, but it was her. The set of her jaw, the way she held her bag close to her chest. It was Marianne. He was about to hand it back when he noticed something on the back. In faded blue ink, in a cramped, masculine handwriting that was definitely not Evelyn's, someone had written 3 words. June 20th, move them soon. His stomach sank. It felt like the ground had dropped out from under him. "This handwriting," he said, his voice strained. "It isn't yours." Evelyn looked at him, her brow furrowed. "No, of course not. I don't know how that got there." Tom didn't answer. He just stared at the cryptic, terrifying message. It implied a plan, a schedule. It implied that Marianne and Rachel weren't just at the clinic by chance. They had been taken before the gas station. Their disappearance was a more complex, drawn-out horror than he had ever imagined. That evening, he drove back to the station. The white daisies were still there, their petals soft against the rust and decay. He didn't touch them. He just let them be, a testament to a stranger's quiet compassion. In the deepening dark, with the wind rolling across the empty gravel lot, the wind chimes in his mind kept ringing, a discordant, maddening tune. Someone had tried to help. Someone had been warned. But it had all come too late. And someone else had been watching them all. Always from the shadows. Always from the back door. The rain had started sometime before dawn, a rare, soft drizzle for this part of Arizona, and by mid-morning, it had soaked through the dusty ground outside the long, low storage facility on the outskirts of Rust Creek. The building was made of corrugated steel, paneled and colorless, just another quiet, anonymous relic of a town built around a road people tried to forget. Tom parked his truck beside the rusted chain-link fence. The gate was already open, swinging slightly in the breeze. Sheriff Mercer was waiting for him under the narrow awning, his arms crossed, the collar of his coat turned up against the damp. He didn't offer any small talk. The time for that was long past. "Unit 14, he said, his voice low. He handed Tom a pair of bolt cutters. "You sure about this?" Tom nodded, his jaw tight. The tip had come from the scrawled message on the back of Evelyn's photo. The handwriting matched some old maintenance logs from a man who used to work for the Department of Transportation. A man who had access to every forgotten corner of this highway. The padlock on the unit door was new, but the name on the rental agreement was not. Robert Hall, Tom read aloud from the paperwork Mercer handed him. Mercer gave a dry, mirthless laugh. "Fake name. We ran it. It's tied to a P.O. box that was paid for in cash for 10 years. But the handwriting on the agreement, it's a perfect match for those old work logs. A man named Clyde Merritt used to do road maintenance and sign repair along I-40 and the state highways back in the day. He disappeared himself in '91. No family came looking. No one looked too hard." Tom fitted the bolt cutters around the lock. With a sharp, satisfying snap, it broke. He pulled up the heavy metal door, the rollers groaning in protest. Inside, the air was damp, cool, and stale. It smelled of mildew and secrets. Faint light from the overcast sky fell across a meticulously organized collection of human tragedy. Stacks of milk crates, sealed plastic bins, and 2 battered duffel bags. Mercer stepped in behind him, his flashlight beam cutting a sharp path through the gloom. It was not chaos. It was careful. A curated collection. Mercer opened a crate labeled NV88. Inside were photo albums. Not family albums. Surveillance photos. A family picnicking at a rest stop. A woman and her daughter getting out of a car at a motel. All taken from a distance. "This isn't just about the Whitakers," Tom said, his voice hollow. "No," Mercer replied, his own voice heavy. Some of these names and faces were starting to match them to missing persons reports from Nevada, Utah, all over the Southwest. All families. All vanished along the same highway corridors. Tom knelt beside a stack of folders labeled AZ June 90. He pulled one out. Inside were photocopies of Rachel's school ID, the receipt from the Coyote Flat gas station, and a folded road map of Arizona. On the map, marked with a tiny, precise red X, was the location of the gas station. "Coyote Flat," Tom said quietly. Mercer had moved toward the back wall of the unit. The paint was chipped and yellowed with moisture. But there, behind a row of neatly stacked boxes, was a symbol. It had been scratched into the plaster with something sharp. A crooked, stylized letter V. It was nearly identical to a symbol Tom had seen in a photograph from the cold case archives, a graffiti tag found at the scene of another, unrelated crime from the 80s. "We think it might be tied to an old crew," Mercer said, his flashlight beam fixed on the symbol. "They ran stolen cars, maybe some low-level trafficking, through Arizona and New Mexico back then. The symbol kept showing up at their stash sites. Then the crew just fell apart, vanished." Tom traced the shape in the air with one gloved finger. The edges were worn. This wasn't new. "So you think Clyde Merritt was part of it? Or a watcher? A freelancer? Maybe more. He leased this unit using a dead man's address. Paid in cash, on time, for years. Then just stopped." Tom looked back at the crates, at the cataloged lives. There was a small cardboard box sealed with yellowed tape. Mercer handed him a utility knife. Inside were objects, each one wrapped carefully in cloth. A pair of children's socks, tiny and worn at the heel. A plastic Tupperware container with a faded name sticker, Sandy. A woman's silver hair clip, tarnished with age. Tom turned each one over in his hands, his movements growing slower, heavier with each new discovery. The last item was a motel key, attached to a faded plastic tag. Room 7, El Canto Inn. The same motel his family had stayed at the night before they disappeared. The place had been bulldozed in '97. Tom held the key in his palm. It felt cold. Mercer spoke from behind him, his voice filled with a weary understanding. "This isn't random. This isn't the work of a disorganized mind. Someone kept this for a reason." He watched them, Tom said, the horrifying truth settling into his bones. Not just the Whitakers. All of them. He collected them. He documented them. like trophies. The rain picked up outside. It began to drum against the metal siding with a quiet, relentless urgency. Tom stood up and looked once more around the storage unit, this library of stolen lives. "We've been looking for one family," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But this was a graveyard." Mercer gave a slow, solemn nod. "The highway keeps its ghosts," he said. "And it looks like Clyde Merritt was the groundskeeper." Tom closed the file folder gently. The crooked V on the wall seemed to watch them in the gloom, a silent, malevolent signature left by a ghost they were now forced to chase. The cabin stood half-swallowed by pinyon pine, juniper, and the slow, inexorable creep of time. It leaned a little to the west, as if it had grown tired of standing upright and holding its secrets. Tom stepped out of the truck, the crunch of the tires on the gravel track being the only sound, quickly absorbed by the immense quiet of the high desert. Mercer stayed behind in the vehicle, giving him this moment alone. The structure hadn't been on any map. No power lines ran to it, no mailbox marked an address. It had taken a week of cross-referencing Clyde Merritt's old DOT maintenance logs with forgotten ranger maps to find this small, isolated plot of land he'd bought for back taxes in the late 80s. There was no road to it now, just the ghost of wheel ruts and the memory of a path. The front door hung slightly ajar. Not forced. Just waiting. Inside, dust motes danced in the shafts of light cutting through the grimy windows. Every surface was coated in a fine, gray ash of settled time. The air was dry but not foul. The place had been lived in. Once. Tom moved slowly, his boots silent on the dusty floorboards. Room to room. It wasn't big. A main room with a stone fireplace, a small bedroom, a tiny kitchen. A bed with a rotting mattress. A simple wooden table. An old oil lantern. On the floor near the fireplace, he saw it. A backpack. A small, red canvas backpack. Faded and dusty, but intact. Joey's. He crouched, his breath catching in his throat. He reached for the zipper with fingers that suddenly felt unsteady, clumsy. Inside were small, ordinary, heartbreaking things. A small box of dull, worn-down crayons. A folded piece of paper. A drawing. A woman with long brown hair holding the hand of a small boy. In the background, there was a tall, shadowy figure. Drawn with black lines only. No face. Just a shape. Tom turned the paper over. The back was blank. Deeper in the bag, wrapped carefully in a cloth napkin, was a photograph. A real one. Marianne, smiling, holding Joey against her chest. Both of them were looking away from the camera, at something that had made them laugh. It was a candid shot, full of life, worn soft at the corners from being held, from being looked at. Then he found the envelope, tucked into an inside pocket. It was unsealed, handwritten. No stamp, no address. To whom it may concern. He opened it with infinite care. The paper was fragile. The letter was dated September 19th, 1990. If you were reading this, it began, then somehow this place was not forgotten. Then somehow, the silence was broken. Tom sat back on his heels, kneeling in the low, dusty light of the abandoned cabin. "My name is Marianne Whitaker. My children, Rachel and Joey, and I were taken from the road outside of Rust Creek. We were kept in a room below the gas station. The man who brought us here, he brought me here, to this cabin. The children are not with me. He told me they were somewhere safe. I don't know if I believe him. He does not speak often, but he listens. Always. From the vents in that room. I know he did." Tom's eyes burned. He blinked hard, forcing himself to keep reading. "He comes at night. Sometimes he brings food. Sometimes nothing. He sits and watches the fire. I believe he is sick. In his mind. A deep, quiet sickness. I do not think he is just a monster. I think he is a man who broke. I do not think he planned this, not at first. I think he watched people on the highway for years. And then one day, something inside him cracked. The handwriting faltered for a few lines, becoming almost illegible. It picked up again, smaller, shakier. Rachel is not well. Her fever was bad when he took me from the room. I have to believe she is okay. I have to. If this is my last chance to speak into the future, I want to say this. We were here. We mattered. We were a family who loved each other very much. Please, if you find this, tell my husband Daniel we tried. We tried so hard to be brave. It was signed simply, Marianne. No last name. No goodbye. Just a line drawn underneath, like the pen had finally slipped from her hand. Tom held the letter in his hands, in the profound silence of the cabin. He didn't hear Mercer coming behind him. The old sheriff didn't speak. He only stood at the doorway, his hat in his hands, his presence a silent acknowledgement of the sacredness of the moment. Tom carefully folded the letter and tucked it back into the envelope. He placed it, and the photograph, back into the red backpack. Then he stood up, his legs stiff. The cabin creaked in the afternoon breeze. Somewhere beyond the trees, a hawk called once, its cry sharp and lonely. Then silence again. He walked out of the cabin slowly. Each step felt both lighter and heavier than the one before. The weight of the terrible truth, and the lightness of finally knowing. They had been there. Rachel had lived long enough to draw her fears. Marianne had written long enough to still believe that someone, someday, might find her words. Hope, even when it was a desperate whisper in the dark, had not vanished completely. The highway had not forgotten, and neither had he. The morning was quiet, cool, and overcast. The sky above Rust Creek held that soft, peaceful gray that sometimes comes after too much relentless sun. There was no formal ceremony, no press conference. Not really. Just people arriving on their own time, drawn to this place by a shared sense of history and sorrow. They carried single flowers, small notes, and a profound, respectful silence. Tom stood near the new, simple wooden fence that had been erected at the edge of the old gas station lot. The building itself had been boarded up again, this time securely. The police tape was long gone. In its place, no one knew who had planted a small, crooked row of wild sunflowers. They were bright against the gray day. He opened the red backpack one last time. He had carried it here himself, not out of obligation, but because it felt right. A journey that needed to end where it began. From inside, he carefully removed the photograph of Marianne and Joey, their faces bright with a lost, carefree laughter. Then he took out the drawing Rachel had made in the dark, the one with the faceless shadow. He pinned them gently side by side against the wooden slats of the fence, using two simple thumbtacks someone had left behind. Behind him, a small crowd lingered. The people of Rust Creek. Evelyn Maddox was there. Harold Boone stood at the very back, his head bowed. A man from the city council held a folder, looking uncomfortable but present. A young mother stood with her small son, quietly trying to explain to him why they were here. There was no speech. A local stonemason had simply unveiled a simple, flat granite stone set into the ground near the fence. It was etched with 4 names: Daniel, Marianne, Rachel, and Joey Whitaker. And below the names, a single, short line: Lost, but not forgotten. 1990. Chalk drawings had appeared overnight on the pavement nearby. One showed a girl with a long, blonde braid. Another, a small boy in a baseball cap holding hands with a raccoon. The morning drizzle had smudged the chalk, giving the figures an almost moving, ephemeral look, like they might fade away at any moment. Mercer arrived late. He moved slower now, the years, in this case, having finally settled deep into his bones. He looked less like the sheriff he once was, and more like a neighbor who brings pies to funerals and knows how to sit in silence on a porch. He didn't approach the fence. He simply gave Tom a long, meaningful nod from across the lot. Then he walked over to the new stone wall, knelt with a grunt, and took a thick, dog-eared folder from inside his coat. It was the original case file. He placed it gently at the base of the stone, a final offering. Then he stood, brushed the dust from his knees, and stepped back. His duty was done. Later, when the small crowd had thinned and only the quiet hush of the afternoon remained, Tom unfolded the last item from the backpack. It was not a note from Rachel or Marianne. It was a printed form, a pre-registration form for the University of Arizona. Rachel's neat, hopeful handwriting filled in half the lines. She had written her name at the top, Rachel Whitaker. Under intended major, she had written literature. And under the box for emergency contact, she had written just 2 words: Mom and Dad. No address, no phone number, just that. The simple, absolute certainty of a child who still believed her parents were her safe harbor. Tom folded it again, the crease sharp and final. He looked up toward the sun, which was now breaking through the clouds, casting long, slanted shafts of gold across the tired pavement. He thought of all the things that would never be known. What happened to Daniel? Where Clyde Merritt had gone to die? Why he chose them? The infinite, agonizing gaps that even answers cannot fill. But he also thought of Rachel, coloring with dull crayons in the dark. Of Joey, humming quietly to his raccoon. Of Marianne, writing not for rescue, but for remembrance. He thought of his brother Daniel, who had laughed too loud and trusted too easily. Of how Marianne always brought her own fancy tea bags and a little tin on road trips. of how Rachel had once asked him, with all seriousness, if the wind in New York felt the same as the wind in Arizona. He stood alone for a while longer. The silence here was different now. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full. Then, carefully, he placed the final item against the fence, next to the photos. It was a laminated, weatherproof copy of Marianne's letter. And beneath it, he affixed a small, simple bronze plaque he'd made. It read, "We were here. We mattered." He stepped back. There was nothing more to find. Only something to hold on to. And sometimes, that is all that remains. The town of Rust Creek did not forget. Neither did he. And somewhere, on a quiet afternoon, a child might ask about the names on the stone and the flowers on the fence. And someone, maybe a teacher, or a stranger passing through, or just an old man sitting on a nearby bench, will tell them. They will say that once, there was a family who loved the open road, who stopped for snacks and snapshots, and who, in the face of an unimaginable darkness, left behind more than just questions. They left behind proof that even in the deepest silence, someone is still listening. And that, sometimes, is the closest thing we get to coming home. What do you think about Tom's final decision to create a memorial of memory rather than continuing the search for a man who was likely long dead? Would you have done something different if you were in his place? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. If this story made you pause, reflect, or feel something quietly powerful, leave a like, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe so you won't miss the next quiet mystery we uncover. I'll see you in the next story, and who knows, next time, it might be your voice remembering a truth long buried.